The Battle of the Bulge began not with tanks, but with cold. An iron, merciless cold that crept into every seam of the Ardennes the moment German artillery opened fire before dawn on December 16, 1944. Snow fell in thick, wind-driven sheets across the forests east of Elsenborn Ridge, coating rifles, boots, helmets, and the long, awkward tubes of the American M1A1 and M9 bazookas. Temperatures plunged well below -15 degrees Celsius, and in those first chaotic hours, the men of the 99th Infantry Division and scattered units of the 2nd and 9th Infantry Division learned a brutal truth. Winter was killing their weapons faster than the Germans were. The bazooka, normally the infantryman's last desperate answer to German armor, fired like a dying animal. Rockets crawled out of the tube with a weak hiss instead of their usual violent roar, arcing downward in slow, humiliating curves that splashed into snowbanks long before reaching the Panzer IVs and StuG 3s advancing through the trees. Private William "Red" Hamlin of the 394th Infantry saw his first shot sputter into the woods at barely 50 yards, far short of the 120-yard range he had trained for at Camp Maxey. Another gunner reported that his rocket flew like a tired bird, dropping just 20 feet from the muzzle. It didn't take long for the truth to spread. The cold was killing the propellant. Inside each M6A3 rocket sat a composition that needed warmth to burn at the correct rate, and in the frozen Ardennes it thickened, slowed, and destabilized. A weapon meant to punch through 80 millimeters of armor now struggled to clear the tree line. German troops advancing behind the spearheads of the 1st SS Panzer Division quickly realized the Americans' rockets weren't performing normally. One Volksgrenadier squad leader later recalled hearing a soft pop instead of the usual cracking blast of a bazooka round, and shouting to his men, "They are shooting duds." For the Americans, it felt like betrayal. The bazooka was supposed to be the equalizer, the one weapon a two-man team could carry that might stop a tank long enough for the rest of the platoon to withdraw. But on the morning of 16 December, as Kampfgruppe Piper's spearheads rolled through Honsfeld and toward Krinkelt, the rocket launchers failed at the exact moment they were needed most. At a roadblock outside Rocherath, a team from the 394th Infantry fired 3 cold rockets at a Panzer IV. All 3 dipped into the snow, harmless, short by dozens of yards. The German tank rumbled forward, its machine guns stitching the roadside ditch, and the bazooka team scrambled back through the trees, cursing the frozen rockets more than the enemy. Through the next 2 days, the problem grew worse. Batteries for the ignition system froze, wires stiffened, even the trigger grips cracked. The M6A3 rockets, meant to be sealed and reliable, were becoming inert lumps. Soldiers tried everything, rubbing rockets with bare hands, knocking ice from tubes, even warming the launchers near burning ration boxes, but nothing restored the biting force the weapon was built for. By December 18th, as German armor pressed against the Elsenborn Ridge and villages like Höfen, Krinkelt, and Rocherath became swirling frozen battlegrounds, the Americans faced a terrifying reality. If the bazooka couldn't fire properly, infantry units had almost no way to stop a tank, short of artillery or mines. The 99th Infantry Division, holding the northern shoulder of the Bulge almost entirely alone, understood this better than anyone. Their thin rifle companies were stretched across miles of forest, hit by some of the best units the German army could still field. And yet in the same foxholes where men shook from cold and fear, something unexpected happened. Someone, no one knows who, made a discovery that spread faster than any official order. A corporal from the 393rd supposedly slipped a rocket under his coat to keep it from freezing, only to find later that it fired straighter and farther than any he had launched since the offensive began. A machine gunner from the 99th swore he saw another bazooka team warming rockets in their armpits. Soon throughout the ridge whispers spread, "Warm the rocket, it will fly." By the night of December 19th, men were tucking rockets inside their M43 jackets, cradling them under their arms, even slipping them between their shirts and long johns as they shivered in their foxholes. It was desperate, it was crude, it was unsanitary, and it worked. The Ardennes winter had taken the roar from the bazooka rockets. Now the soldiers were determined to give it back. The discovery spread the way battlefield miracles always do, not through orders, not through doctrine, but through whispers passed from foxhole to foxhole, as exhausted men clung to anything that might keep them alive. By the night of December 19, the 99th Infantry Division's thin defensive line along Elsenborn Ridge had already repelled multiple armored probes, and each attack made the same bitter truth clearer. Cold rockets were almost useless. But warmed rockets? Those were different. Word traveled like a spark on dry tinder. In the dark woods near the twin villages of Krinkelt Rocherath, a sergeant from the 394th told a neighboring squad, "Warm the round and you'll get your range back." Near Höfen, a radio operator relayed a similar message after overhearing it on a company net. "Heat the rocket, it burns hotter." No one knew who discovered it first. No one cared. What mattered was that it worked. The M6A3 rocket's propellant, normally stable and consistent, thickened in extreme cold. Instead of generating a sharp, high-energy burn that launched the warhead with deadly velocity, it sputtered and underperformed. But when a soldier held the rocket inside his jacket for 5 to 8 minutes, the chemical reaction stabilized, the propellant warmed, and the rocket regained its proper burn rate. It was not factory science. It was battlefield survival. And soon every bazooka team on the northern shoulder of the Bulge adopted the method as instinctively as breathing. On the morning of December 20th, with snow falling in small, stinging flakes, Corporal Edwin Haskins and Private Lloyd Burke of the 393rd Infantry crouched behind a collapsed barn wall overlooking a narrow road leading toward Krinkelt. A German half-track, followed by infantry and what sounded like a StuG-3, was approaching. Haskins pulled a rocket from its fiber tube and shoved it under his M43 jacket, pressing it against his ribs. The thing was ice cold, cold enough to burn. Burke glanced over, eyebrows raised. "You warming it or hugging it?" Haskins muttered, teeth chattering, "Trying to keep us alive." Minutes later, when the German half-track rounded the corner, treads squealing on ice, Haskins shouldered the bazooka and fired. The rocket streaked down range in a straight, violent line, nothing like the weak arcs of the previous days. It slammed into the side armor of the half-track and tore it apart in a burst of flame and shrapnel. German infantry scattered. The StuG pulled back behind a tree line. Burke shouted over his ears, "It worked! Christ, it actually worked!" Reports like this multiplied across the ridge. Near the village of Honsfeld, another team fired a warmed rocket nearly 90 yards, a distance no German tanker expected the Americans to reach in -18°C conditions. The round struck the frontal plate of a Panzer IV and cracked it, forcing the tank to reverse out of the kill zone. At Losheimer Graben, a two-man team from the 2nd Infantry Division used warmed rockets to disable a command half-track from Kampfgruppe Piper, halting a column long enough for American artillery to find the range and destroy the lead vehicles. The tactic was crude, desperate, and improvised, but it was also effective enough to change the tempo of small unit fights. Suddenly, German armor could not assume immunity outside 50 yards. Suddenly, every snowbank, every hedgerow, every smoking ruin might conceal a bazooka with a rocket warmed under a frightened American's armpit. German officers noticed. A captured diary from a Volksgrenadier platoon leader contained a shaken line written on December 21st. "Americans fire Panzerabwehr rockets farther than expected in cold." Or another after-action observation from the 12th SS Panzer Division. Bazooka accuracy unexpectedly high despite freezing weather. That accuracy was no accident. It was the product of cold, hunger, terror, and invention. At battalion aid stations and makeshift command posts, officers began hearing the same story again and again. "Sir, warm the rocket." though never officially issued as doctrine. No quartermaster manual ever endorsed stuffing high-explosive ordnance into one's jacket. The improvisation spread so widely that by December 21st it became, in effect, a standardized field technique across multiple regiments of the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions. Major Harry Parker of the 99th later wrote, "We learned to fight the weather the same as the enemy. The cold was our first obstacle. The Germans were the second." But the discovery brought new problems too. Rockets warmed too long risked moisture condensation inside the firing leads, making ignition unreliable. Soldiers learned to warm them gradually. Some tucked them under their arms. Others slipped them against their stomachs inside their wool shirts. A few placed them near small tin can fires briefly before sliding them under their coats. The technique was primitive, awkward, and miserable, but undeniably effective. By the evening of December 21st, as winds howled across the ridge and snow thickened into drifts, American positions that had seemed doomed 2 days earlier now held a tenuous but real confidence. The Germans were still coming. Their armor was still deadly. Their infantry was still determined. But now the Americans had teeth again. Teeth warmed by human desperation and the last body heat men were willing to share with a weapon that had betrayed them at dawn, but fought for them at dusk. The winter still ruled the Ardennes. The cold still choked engines, froze oil, stiffened triggers, and cracked metal. But now the Americans had found a way to beat it, one rocket at a time, one heartbeat at a time, until the snow itself could no longer silence their last desperate weapon against the German armored tide. Through the night of December 21, the snow deepened across the twin villages of Krinkelt, Rocherath, until the roads vanished under white drifts, and the wrecks of American trucks and German half-tracks froze into solid ice sculptures. The battlefield had become a muffled, colorless world where shapes moved as shadows and sound carried strangely, bouncing between stone walls and snow-choked pines. It was in this frozen maze that the warmed Bazooka rockets proved themselves not just a clever trick, but a decisive weapon in the savage house-to-house fighting that now unfolded against elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division and Kampfgruppe Piper's shattered vanguard. At dawn on December 22, a Panzer IV advanced cautiously down the main street of Krinkelt, its engine coughing clouds of steam as the -20°C air bit into the cold metal. American riflemen of the 393rd Infantry watched helplessly from shattered doorways. They had seen cold rockets fail before and assumed the bazooka team beside them was doomed. But Private Frank Doss, a wiry Texan with shaking hands and frostbitten ears, was pressing a rocket under his armpit as though trying to warm a newborn child. His assistant loader, PFC Ray Collins, whispered a time count. 5 minutes. 6. 7. When the tank clattered into full view, Doss shouldered the launcher, exhaled through clenched teeth, and fired. The rocket screamed across nearly 90 yards, an impossible distance in weather like this, and struck the Panzer's side armor just behind the road wheels. The explosion snapped a track, sending the tank slewing sideways until it ground to a halt, its turret whipping frantically toward the source of the shot. Doss and Collins sprinted through a back alley as the Panzer sprayed the house they had fired from with machine gun fire. But the important thing was done. The warmed rocket had hit with full force, proving beyond doubt that this improvised method worked even under combat pressure. German infantry accompanying the tank hesitated. They had expected the Americans' anti-tank weapons to be crippled by the deep freeze, not striking with unexpected range and accuracy. Moments like this multiplied across the twin villages throughout the day. In a snowy orchard east of Rocherath, Sergeant Harold Klein and his bazooka loader hid behind a stone wall as two StuG-3 assault guns inched forward, probing for weak spots with their hull-mounted guns. Klein warmed two rockets inside his coat until he could feel their metal casings sting against his ribs. When the first StuG exposed its flank while negotiating a frozen ditch, he fired and missed high by inches. The second shot, still warm, still burning hot, hit the commander's cupola and blotated the hatches outward. The second StuG pivoted toward their position, but American riflemen and machine guns hammered it until it withdrew into the trees. A German soldier captured later that night told interrogators, "Your rockets should not reach us in this cold. They should fall short." That disbelief became a pattern. Reports from the 12th SS Panzer Division noted that American bazookas were striking at unanticipated ranges. Sturmgeschütz crews, accustomed to using winter conditions as protection, suddenly found themselves losing vehicles in situations where the temperature should have made bazooka fire almost harmless. At the same time, the tactic created logistical chaos for American units. Rockets warmed too early lost their heat before firing. Others absorbed moisture from being pressed against damp wool uniforms, requiring men to wipe down ignition wires with bare, freezing fingers. Bazooka teams rotated rockets like cooks rotating loaves in an oven, one warming, one loaded, one ready. In some squads, soldiers shared body heat to keep the rockets warm, tucking them inside blankets or sleeping bags, while the gunner rotated tubes and batteries to keep them from cracking. The Ardennes was turning the infantry into inventors. By the afternoon of December 22, the Germans launched one of their fiercest assaults against the American line. Waves of Volksgrenadiers pushing through waist-deep snow, supported by armor lumbering down narrow trails where mines had already claimed several Panzers. In a blasted farmhouse on the western edge of Rocherath, an improvised four-man bazooka team, two gunners and two rocket warmers, fought like a single organism. Rockets moved from coat to launcher in a smooth, frantic rhythm. One round crippled a Panzer IV by blowing off its return roller. Another smashed into a command half-track carrying radio equipment. A third rocket fired at nearly 100 yards hit the glacis of a StuG-3 with enough force to crack the front plate and send the vehicle reversing into a snowbank. As darkness fell and tracer fire stitched across the sky, the German assault stalled. Meanwhile, on the south edge of Krinkelt, near the crossroads where American units were desperately trying to withdraw toward Elsenborn Ridge, a final dramatic moment unfolded. Two warmed rockets, carried in the inner lining of a soldier's field jacket for more than 15 minutes, were fired at a Panther that had been pounding American positions since morning. The first round struck the mantlet and failed to penetrate. The second hit the thinner lower hull plate and detonated with a crack that echoed across the snowfields. Flames burst from the tank's engine deck as the crew bailed out into the freezing night. It was one of the only Panthers disabled by bazooka fire during the entire Ardennes campaign, and it happened because the rocket had been heated. By the end of December 23, the battered remnants of German armor withdrew from the twin villages. The defense of Krinkelt-Rocherath had held. The northern shoulder of the bulge would not break. And among the many reasons, deadly American artillery, stubborn infantry, perfect use of terrain, was a tiny, desperate trick born in a foxhole, warming a rocket with the heat of a human body. In a battle defined by cold, it was heat, not firepower alone, that kept the Americans alive.
By the morning of December 24, the Americans holding the northern shoulder of the bulge had learned something the Germans had not, that in a winter where steel froze, batteries died, and engines choked on ice-crusted fuel, The warmest weapon on the battlefield was the one pressed against a soldier's skin. The technique of heating bazooka rockets, at first a desperate improvisation, then a whispered rumor, was now a standard battlefield rhythm across the 99th Infantry Division, the 2nd Infantry Division, and portions of the 9th and 30th Infantry Divisions moving in to reinforce the line. No manual endorsed it, no officer wrote it into doctrine, but across Elsenborn Ridge, Malmedy's snow-choked outskirts, and the scattered forests west of Bühlingen, American infantry had become chemists of survival. They had found a way to turn body heat into velocity, warmth into armor-piercing force, and now, as Kampfgruppe Piper's remaining vehicles limped northeast under constant harassment, the warmed rockets would be used not just to survive, but to strike back. Snow fell in a slow, hypnotic drift over the ridge as Christmas Eve dawned, but there was nothing peaceful about the battlefield. The Germans had thrown their strongest armor at the northern shoulder for nearly a week. Panzer IVs, Panthers, StuG 3s, and armored half-tracks carrying grenadiers who believed the Americans were on the brink of collapse. Instead, they found riflemen who refused to break, and bazooka teams who fired with a range winter should have stolen from them. In the forest west of Domain Bütgenbach, Sergeant Alan McMaguire of the 26th Infantry crouched with his loader behind a snowy hump of shattered earth left by an artillery crater. A self-propelled gun, likely a StuG 3, was creeping along a tree-lined path, its low-slung profile nearly invisible in the whiteout. Maguire pressed a rocket beneath his coat, letting the metal bite into his stomach. His loader, Private Henry Nall, kept the launcher aimed, breath rising in crystal puffs. When the StuG exposed its flank, Maguire loaded the warmed round and fired. The rocket streaked across the clearing with such ferocity that Nall muttered, "Damn, that one screamed." It struck the StuG's right sponson with a burst of flame. The German vehicle slewed sideways and stopped dead in the snow. In the hours that followed, stories accumulated like spent casings. A three-man team from the 30th Infantry Division fired 2 warmed rockets at a command half-track, carrying officers from the 1st SS Panzer Division. Both rockets hit, destroying the vehicle in a shower of white-hot shrapnel. Near Bühlingen, a bazooka team fired at a reconnaissance vehicle at nearly 120 yards, far beyond expected winter range. When interrogated later, a captured German sergeant asked, "How do your rockets fly in this cold?" The Americans simply shrugged. They had no technical explanation to give, only a practical one. "We warm them." But the warming tactic created challenges that only soldiers in the field could solve. Moisture from sweat condensed on metal, threatening to short the ignition. Some men wrapped rockets in spare socks or pieces of wool from torn blankets. Others built tiny fires shielded under their coats, risking burns, singed uniforms, or accidental ignition. At least one rocket reportedly flashed prematurely when overheated inside a soldier's jacket, though the blast was contained enough that the gunner survived with severe burns. Word spread instantly: warm the rocket, don't cook it. Despite the risks, the tactic worked often enough to shift German expectations. On December 24, Piper's remaining armor withdrew eastward, harassed by American patrols who now had functional anti-armor capabilities even at -18 degrees Celsius air. German after-action reports noted unexpected bazooka effectiveness at long distances and American rockets retaining power in freezing temperatures. What they didn't know was that the Americans were using their own bodies as chemical warmers. Meanwhile, the weather tightened its grip on everything else. Machine guns froze, mortars misfired, rifles jammed unless kept bone dry. But the bazooka, temperamental, underpowered in extreme cold, often inaccurate, was now reliable again, thanks to the warmth of the men who carried it. Christmas morning brought no respite. The sky stayed gray, snow drifted waist-deep, but the front stabilized. By December 25, the northern shoulder had become a fortress of ice and iron, held by men who had been outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly outflanked, but who still controlled the key high ground. And on December 26th, as the collapsing remnants of Kampfgruppe Piper abandoned their last vehicles near La Glaise, American patrols moved forward with a grim certainty. The worst of the northern fighting was ending. The line had held, and one of the smallest factors, barely mentioned in any official report, was the warmth passed from human skin into freezing steel, turning dead rockets into lethal ones again. The Germans had counted on cold to silence the Americans' last-ditch weapon. Instead, the Americans had turned the cold into just another problem to be solved, another battlefield to master. Winter had taken the heart from their rockets. The men had given it back.
By December 26th, as the last armored remnants of Kampfgruppe Piper sputtered out near La Glaise and abandoned their fuel-starved Panthers in the snow, the northern shoulder of the Bulge had solidified into a wall the Germans could no longer break. Snow still fell in wind-ripped veils across Elsenborn Ridge, Malmedy, and the battered villages the Americans had defended for nearly 10 relentless days, but the worst of the crisis was over. And scattered across the white forests were the men who had, through grit, cold, and improvisation, reshaped the performance of the one weapon winter had nearly stolen from them, the bazooka. Their improvised trick, warming M6A3 rockets against their skin, under their coats, inside wool blankets, or clutched in freezing armpits, had become more than a survival method. It had become a battlefield adaptation so widespread that by late December, it quietly influenced engagements from dumb Bütgenbach to the snowy crossroads south of Honsfeld. The winter had changed the weapon. The men had changed it back. In the days following December 26th, as American forces pushed to seal gaps in the line and clear out German stragglers retreating eastward, patrols from the 99th, 2nd, and 30th Infantry Divisions advanced through forests littered with shell craters, burned-out half-tracks, dead pack animals, and the dark husks of tanks that had died with their engines frozen solid. The cold only deepened, dropping below -20 degrees Celsius on several nights. Bazooka teams continued warming rockets the same way they had during the fiercest fighting. Walking patrols tucked them under their coats while moving single file through snowdrifts. Ambush teams kept one rocket in a sleeve of wool while another rested against the stomach of a man lying in an icy ditch. Soldiers joked bitterly that they were hatching eggs, but the humor barely covered the exhaustion. Still, the method worked. On December 28th, a reconnaissance patrol from the 30th Infantry Division encountered a German armored car near Bellecroix. Only one rocket was ready, warmed by being tucked inside a corporal's field jacket for nearly 20 minutes. The round fired with full velocity, crossing almost 100 yards before striking the vehicle's left wheel assembly and flipping it into a ditch. The patrol returned with stunned German prisoners who kept asking how the bazooka had functioned in such brutal cold. Snow muffled their footsteps as they marched, but their disbelief traveled clearly in the air. In early January 1945, as American forces counterattacked to regain ground toward the towns of Thiramond, Meiringen, and Ligneville, the warmed rocket tactic followed them. It had become second nature. Even new replacements arriving at the line learned it within minutes of their first snowfall. "Cold rocket won't fly," veterans told them. "Warm it till it hurts your ribs, then shoot." In mid-January, near the forest roads east of Elsenborn, a two-man team from the 9th Infantry Regiment used warmed rockets to disable a Panzer IV that was attempting to cover a German withdrawal. Their first shot tore through the turret ring. The second, a round warmed by being held between two soldiers' chests under a wet blanket, finished the job. German records from this phase of the Bulge reflected an increasing unease. Reports from the 12th SS Panzer Division noted American anti-tank rockets no longer limited by cold. A German officer captured on January 5th insisted the Americans must have received new winter rockets. He refused to believe the truth when told. The Americans were simply warming them by hand. But the tactic was more than ingenuity. It was the product of necessity. No ordnance officer could deliver LOA or low-temperature optimized fuels to every frontline unit. No quartermaster could fight the weather for them. If the men wanted their rockets to fly true, they had to give the weapon their own heat. Looking back, the miracle was not that the rocket warmed, it was that the men kept going.
Frostbite chewed through fingertips, trigger grips shattered so often that soldiers swapped battery packs between launchers like spare parts from a dying machine. Yet bazooka teams kept firing, and every warmed rocket that struck its target carried a quiet truth. The Americans held the northern shoulder not only with artillery, rifles, and machine guns, but with body heat turned into chemical force. When the Bulge finally ended on January 25, 1945, and the U.S. First Army declared the German offensive spent, ordnance officers began collecting data for after-action reports. Buried in those technical notes, far below discussions of artillery performance, rifle malfunctions, lubrication failures, and frozen bolts, were brief mentions of the bazooka trick. Rocket propellant underperforms below -10 degrees Celsius. Field expedient warming restores burn rate. Technique widely adopted by infantry in early phase of the Ardennes. Nowhere did the reports mention the human cost. The men shivering in foxholes, sharing their last warmth with a piece of metal so it could save them. The tactic never appeared in official training manuals. No commander gave a formal order authorizing it, and yet it lived on in the stories told by veterans decades after the war. Men from the 99th, 2nd, and 30th Divisions recalled pressing rockets under their coats, feeling the sting of cold metal, hearing the sharper hiss when a warmed round fired, watching it streak toward a tank that winter should have protected. One veteran from the 394th Infantry said simply, "The cold took the fight out of the rocket, so we put it back in." That was the legacy of the warmed rockets. Not technology, not doctrine, but the stubborn refusal of American infantry to let winter decide the battle. In a forest where even the air seemed ready to kill them, they found warmth enough to keep their last anti-tank weapon alive. And because of that small, improvised spark of human ingenuity, the northern shoulder held firm. The Bulge broke, not the men who fought there.